So I want to welcome everyone to the Reparation Information Thought Series. The Thought Series is a periodic strategic webinar featuring reparations experts, racial justice thought leaders, and you engaged in critical discussion, reflection, and analysis on issues pertinent to the movement for reparatory justice in the United States and abroad. I'm very proud to say that this is the second year of the Reparation Information Thought Series, co-hosted by my colleague, Jessica Ann Mitchell-Arewar, also known as JAM, who is the Executive Director of the National Black Cultural Information Trust, as well as myself, Attorney Nikichi Taifa, with the Reparation Education Project. So we want to welcome everyone to today's fascinating discussion with a fascinating featured presenter. We have none other than Areva Martin, an award-winning civil rights attorney, a sought-after on-air legal commentator, and a nationally recognized children's, women's, and disability rights advocate. Areva has been dubbed America's advocate for her hard-hitting, no-holds-barred commentary on today's most pressing legal and social justice issues. Throughout her career, Areva Martin has fought for a lot of modern day Emmett Tills who have been beaten, battered, silenced, and shortchanged by the system. An honors graduate of Harvard Law School, she is the founding principal of Martin and Martin LLP. And welcome, Areva. How are you?
I am doing well. Thank you so much. I'm so grateful to be sharing space with you and your network and all of the folks who are on this webinar. Again, thank you for having me.
So, myself and my co-host Jessica, also known as Jam, just saw you in Evanston, Illinois. And then right on the heels of that, I don't even know if you had gotten back to California, but I turn on CNN and see you up there commentating on the oh my God, the verdict. I mean, in the Jordan Neely case. I mean, you are really on it. And expressing some of the heartfelt issues that we face as a people. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Jam, and we're going to get this show started.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us, Areva. I think that a lot of people have interest in this recent reparations victory for Palm Springs Section 14 survivors, but not many people really know the story. So what is Section 14?
Great. Again, thank you. It was great seeing both of you in Evanston. Always great to have social justice advocates gather to talk about these important cases. Section 14 is a 646 acres of land in 1 square mile in Palm Springs, California. Sometimes people hear Palm Springs, they think of Florida, but no, this is California. Palm Springs is about 100 miles east of Los Angeles. It's in the desert. In the 1930s and 40s, it was this barren desert community, most of the property owned by the Agua Caliente tribe, indigenous tribe. But in that time period, during that time period, the tribe did not have sovereignty and power over its own land. The land was controlled by the government, even though it was the U.S. government, even though it was owned by the tribe. In the 30s and 40s, as African Americans were trying to escape the Jim Crowism of the South, many of them were looking for communities in the North, in the West, where they could move, where they could raise their families, where they could pursue the American dream. So two things were kind of happening at the same time. Black folks and Latinos looking for opportunities, looking for places that weren't as oppressive as the South. And Palm Springs was looking to develop this desert community into a desert oasis, a vacation getaway, particularly for those Hollywood elites that were just about 90 to 100 miles away, given that most of the studios at that time were in Los Angeles. So you had this perfect marriage. You had people who wanted to work, and you had a city that was looking for laborers and workers. And so that's what happened. The Black and brown community moving into Palm Springs went there for jobs. The city welcomed them because they needed them. They needed folks to help build their bridges, their roads, their golf courses, their tennis courts. And they needed people to provide the domestic work. Because if you got Gene Autry and Lucille Ball and Frank Sinatra, well, guess what? They're not driving their own cars. They're not washing their cars. They're not even, raising their kids in the way that we think of. They're not cooking their meals. They're not washing their clothes. So you had a lot of Black women in that period serving as domestics in the homes, and men serving as butlers and chauffeurs, and providing those kind of domestic services to these wealthy people. And although California was very different than the South, there were still racially restrictive covenants in Palm Springs, California, that prevented these Black and brown families from living in the neighborhoods where the white folks that they supported lived. So it was only the indigenous tribe that was willing to allow Black and brown people to live on their property. Now, they couldn't sell the property to Black and brown folks because they didn't exercise control over it. It was something that was controlled by the government. But they did allow them to build homes, to bring mobile homes, and to create structures on this land. So the Black, brown community, the white community in Palm Springs kind of coexisted peacefully. Black people did what we do everywhere in this country. They took what they had. They took those lemons. They made lemonade. They built a thriving community. They built the first Baptist church. The Latino community had a Catholic church. So they built cultural and religious institutions. They lived in harmony. And that was really important because they had this rich community and they had these shared interests. They were fighting against the oppression of whites. They were all working, trying to build a better life for their children and grandchildren. Well, after, and I'll say after because if you think about this in kind of a timeline, Palm Springs developed, and it did become known throughout the country. Snowbirds who wanted to come in out of the cold wanted to come to Palm Springs for a respite in the winter months. And Palm Springs city fathers decided that it wasn't going to be a good idea to have this Black and brown and indigenous community in the heart of what was becoming its downtown. That this was an eyesore, that it was incongruent with the topography and the rest of this community that was becoming so well known and so popular. So they wanted to get rid of this community, and they didn't own the land. The city didn't, so they didn't use eminent domain. Eminent domain wasn't available to them because the land was owned by the indigenous tribe, and there's a whole tribal court situation that has to happen when you do anything that involves indigenous people. So rather than try to use any legal court proceedings, they just simply decided to use force. So they went, some clients of mine told me, by word of mouth, telling people you have to move. They're going to start burning these houses. They're going to start demolishing this community. Now, some of my clients tell me they got no notice. They came home and they saw smoke bellowing. They saw their community up in fire. So the city of Palm Springs used the fire department to burn out this 646 acres, this 1 square mile. What had to be, historical record is a little fuzzy, but we believe to be about 2,000 to 2,500 homes at the height of the popularity of this community. And they simply demolished it. And people were scattered, they were upended, they were pushed to the outskirts of the city. Some left this town altogether, but it was a horrific, racially targeted attack on a predominantly Black community. Some folks went to the California Attorney General and complained. The Attorney General wrote a scathing report in 1968 calling what happened in Palm Springs a city-engineered Holocaust, and admonishing the city for tearing this community up, burning this community down without as much as a dollar being given as relocation fees or any compensation to the families whose lives were completely disrupted. So that is the history of Palm Springs and the history of Section 14.
So basically, just what happened to the families during and following this displacement?
Many of them.
And it's a mild term for this Holocaust, this genocide. I mean, what happened to the Black folk?
Most of them were pushed to the outskirts of the city that was basically inhabitable. Eventually, developers started building some housing on what's now considered the north end of the city, and you start to see Black families migrate to the north end. established kind of a permanent underclass in Palm Springs. Right now, to this day, the North End is where most of the Black families live. Many of them live in substandard housing. They suffer from lack of access to health care. They still have a huge economic gap in terms of revenue, in terms of income and wealth in the city. So families were dispersed. Many will tell you their families traumatized by this. Many succumbed to alcoholism, homelessness, and all of the woes that you can imagine that happens when your community is upended and you lose your political power, you lose your agency, you lose your connections to other families. So it was a devastating, blow to this community.
It's just wild to hear you talk about the fire department participating in this. I think I've seen a couple of conversations about how we think about how police forces were used against Black and Brown communities, but then also folks coming back and looking at the history and realizing the fire departments that were meant to protect our communities participated in this, which is another component of community policing. So that is just outrageous. How long have the families been fighting for reparations? When did they start these groups and start organizing for reparative justice?
That's a great question. And just to your point about the fire department, you're absolutely right. So that department that you would typically be calling, saying my house is on fire, they are the very same department that has caused the fire. They're the arsonists. They're lighting the match and starting the fire. So you can't call them. So there's no one to call, right? There is no one that was going to come to the aid of these families. So there were family members in the 1960s that went to the city to protest, that tried to challenge the city. And it appeared to be almost every decade. In the 70s, some group would get together and try to go to the city to seek some kind of justice from the city. And each decade where you saw activists trying to get some kind of reparative justice, they were shot down. They were dismissed. They were overlooked. They were unsuccessful. So it wasn't until the murder of George Floyd, and it wasn't until we saw this racial reckoning, that little 6-month window, I'll call it, from May of 2020 to December of 2020, that movement started to occur. And it was started because the mayor that was the mayor during the critical time of this, this attack, this racially motivated attack, was also not just a racist, according to some people, but he, according to some, was homophobic. And since the 90s, 2000s, Palm Springs has become a haven for the LGBTQ community. And it has probably a predominant part of its population are members of that community. So after George Floyd's murder, we saw the removal of statues happening all over the country. So there became this effort, mobilized in some parts, in some ways, by the LGBTQ community and the Black and Brown community, to remove this big bronze statue that had been placed in front of City Hall, memorializing this mayor. His name is Frank Bogart. So those communities came together and in a powerful way were able to force the city to remove that statue of Frank Bogart. And it was through that process that the Section 14 survivors and descendants who were involved in that statue removal process were able to press the city and to get the city in 2021 to issue an apology. And what's important about this, and we talk a lot about this in this reparative justice movement, or maybe we don't talk enough about it, is coalition building. And understanding the power base in each of the communities where these fights are happening. So in the 60s and 70s, Black folks didn't have the allyship of the people who were powerful in that city to move this issue forward. So they were unsuccessful. But it was the alignment with the gay community in Palm Springs around this statute that really gave momentum to the Section 14 survivors and descendants. And it wasn't until that allyship, formed around that statue removal that we started to see the city pay attention to this issue that impacted not the gay community, but the Black and brown community.
Thank you so much. How many, I've had the honor of meeting some of the survivors at an event recently held by Liberation Ventures.
Yes.
Um, and so that was amazing to be able to talk to them, and they spoke very highly of you.
Oh,
And how many organizations were involved? Was it I know the Section 14 survivors. Are there any other organizations that were involved in this process of moving it forward, or it's just overall community coalition building?
no, the main organization, so the Section 14 organization was formed. The woman I think you met in St. Louis, her name is Pearl Devers. She is the lead plaintiff, claimant. She's also the founder and president of the Section 14 organization. And Pearl, born and raised in Palm Springs, lived on Section 14, whole family there. Her husband lived there, met her husband in that community. They were married and started to raise their children in Palm Springs. But she had retired and moved outside of Palm Springs. And she was actually called by residents that still live in Palm Springs as this organizing was taking place. And someone reached out to her and they said, Pearl, they are starting to talk about Section 14, but the people that are talking about it, they didn't live there. They don't have our lived experiences. We really need you. We need you to come back so that when these city hall meetings are taking place, you know, you live there. You were a witness to the atrocity. And so Pearl was summoned really back to, she was about 90 miles away. She was summoned to come into that community, and she had the foresight to form this 501c organization. So when I met her and started representing the group, they had already formed the 501c nonprofit.
So can you share with us a little bit about how you came to represent the survivors and just how the negotiations started?
So I met an activist who had been involved in Palm Springs, and she just started sharing with me what was happening. And she says, wow, they really need a lawyer that has civil rights experience and that has media experience. She says, because they've been trying to elevate this story outside of the Palm Springs community and they haven't been having any success. Would you be willing to talk to Pearl Devers? Is who she told me. I said, absolutely. So I had a conversation with Pearl and we just hit it off. I was really impressed with the fact that she had already started a nonprofit. She's a retiree in her mid-70s, had never done this kind of work before, but had figured that part out. They did have a lawyer. He wasn't a civil rights attorney. He was a sole practitioner, really had done more criminal law. She had searched a year. She said she called every high-profile lawyer she could think of, and they all told her no, because the action, literally, this happened over 60 years ago. And folks were telling her, we don't see a pathway forward, given that the statutes of limitations that would be applicable to this claim have long since run. And obviously the group had no money, had very limited resources, most of them retirees. And so she had not had a lot of success. And the local press had pretty much bought into the narrative of the city fathers and former city managers that this community was a blighted, dilapidated community that was a public nuisance that needed to be destroyed. And this was just another urban renewal project, similar to urban renewal projects that happened all over this country. So when I met them, they were pretty deflated. They had been trying on their own and with the help of this lawyer to deal with the city after the apology had been issued. And it was almost a year after the apology and a directive from the then mayor for the city manager to work with the families. They had met with the city manager on a couple of occasions, but they were going nowhere. So I came in August of 22 and took over the case. And the thing that I did immediately is met with the city attorney, met with the mayor of Palm Springs. And the city attorney was very honest. He says, look, it's not that we're purposely dragging our feet. Is that we've never dealt with a matter like this because this is not what typical cities do. This isn't what city attorneys typically do. It's not your typical city attorney matter. And I asked him if he was willing to come to the conference, the first response conference. I had been invited by Dr. Julianne Malvo and Dr. Ron Daniels. And I told them, I said, I'm going to this reparations conference in Evanston. The city attorney from Evanston, who had just been involved in the reparations project in Evanston, is going to be there. Maybe city attorney to city attorney, you can learn something about this process. And I reached out to the mayor. She was the first Latina mayor for the city of Palm Springs. Her background is in civil rights law as well. And I invited them to the conference, and they came in November, December of 2022. And that was very helpful, I think, in terms of opening their eyes to the fact that this movement was happening all over the country, that there were other jurisdictions looking at how they could address racial harms in their own communities. So that started what I thought was going to be a smooth negotiation process. We get back to California. They meet Linda Mann, they meet Jason Hansford at the conference, and we agreed that a harms report needed to be done for the city because it had not been done. The plaintiffs, I had hired Dr. Julianne Malvo. We did our own informal study, but we all agreed. They did an RFP. Linda Mann, Jason Hansford responded. I think they only had a couple of folks that responded. The city staff recommended Linda and her team. We are in Sacramento. I'm in Sacramento. We're meeting with the Legislative Black Caucus. This is now fast forward to April of 2023. We think things are great. Linda and her team's going to get hired. They're going to come in. This is going to be a survivor-led process, and it's going to be easy peasy. Well, we started getting calls in Sacramento that the meeting was going south, that council members were really, really challenging Linda, who was on a Zoom at the time of this meeting. Residents who support Frank Bogart, they call themselves the Friends of Frank Bogart, showed up in mass to oppose the city hiring Linda. They said her team was biased, that she couldn't be objective, that she was an outsider. I think her contract was around $350,000, that it was too expensive, and just on and on and on. End of the meeting, a contentious 3-hour meeting, a no vote for Linda and her team. And that began the very, very acrimonious negotiation process. So from April through, I'd say, October, there were conversations. We met with certain members of the city council, but they took a very strident position that they were willing to consider some programmatic reparative justice items, but they were not going to pay any money, that they wanted to do their own study by a local group, and they weren't going to move forward on this until they commissioned their own group, did their own study, and any kind of monetary compensation was totally off the table. So that we went back and forth, and they were pretty strident in that position throughout 2023. During this time period, we're holding activations, we're holding marches, we're holding prayer vigils. We have brought on a PR team. We're engaged with, we had elevated the story outside of the local press. We're fighting with the local press about the narrative. We're doing storytelling. We're doing this organizing. We're building coalition with the LGBTQ community and other organizations in Palm Springs. And I would say a turning point in those negotiations is when we decided we had to amp up our strategy. Maybe in a political campaign, you would say we had to go negative. We did a billboard campaign and a social media campaign because we felt we needed to bring some outside pressure. We needed for folks who were vacationing in Palm Springs to understand this history, because this was the best kept secret ever. Even folks in California don't know about the history of these Black and brown folks. People will tell you, oh my God, I didn't even know Black people lived in Palm Springs. And we worked with we changed PR teams. We brought in a much more sophisticated strategy team, and we put up a billboard campaign and social media campaign called Did You Know?
Mhm.
And it was Did You Know or Do You Know the history of Palm Springs? And we put up pictures of burning buildings, burning homes, juxtaposed with the palm trees and the beautiful topography of Palm Springs. And that sent the city council members ballistic. It got their attention. And we immediately got a call to come back to the negotiation table. And that's what brought us back in January of 2024. And money was put back. Well, I shouldn't say back, because it was never on the table. The possibility of there being a cash part of this resolution was, for the first time, being considered by the city.
That is amazing. It's sad that you have to go that route, but you got to give the visual some time and let people know that this is very serious to us. You know, this is what happened to our communities, and we're not going to let it rest. We did get someone saying that Pearl would be joining, so I'm trying to see if I can get her on in just a second.
Oh,
But
okay. Yeah, great. That'd be great. She's on vacation and I was trying not to bother her. Woman is so hardworking. It's important for everyone on this call to know this movement. And I mean, I live in Los Angeles. Pearl lives, like I said, about 90 miles outside. We were in Palm Springs once a month, sometimes twice a month. This is a senior-led movement. My clients' average age, these survivors, are 75, 80 plus years old, many in wheelchairs, many on walkers and canes. And I mean, we held on MLK Day, we marched. We did like a 1.5 mile march to a church. We did prayer vigils. We did justice rallies. I mean, we organized like you would expect to see, college students organizing on college campuses, or, some of the Black Lives Matters, marches. This group of seniors use technology. They use Facebook. They use a texting app to communicate, monthly Zoom calls. So this was a very, very, I'm gonna call it sophisticated, coordinated, organizing strategy, again, led by people in their mid to late 70s.
that is amazing. While I look to see if we can get Pearl on, can we go into what the reparations package included? I know that there was some cash, and then there's programmatic things. What all is included in this?
So it is a $27 million historic agreement, and it's historic on a lot of different levels. One, because we know victims-led actions for reparative justice happen so infrequently in our country, and particularly victims who are Black and Brown. There are very, very few examples that we can point to where, Evanston was led in part by a city councilwoman, Robin Ruth Simmons, and a city-led process, although it became a community process. So I don't want to minimize the involvement of the community, but this was truly led by citizens and opposed initially by the city. So even though Palm Springs is a pretty liberal city, and I had to reiterate this Friday at a celebration we had, we went into this with 2 votes and 3 solid no's. Solid, absolutely, categorically no. So we had to turn those votes, and that $27 million agreement was voted on unanimously by all 5 of those city council members. So we went from 2 yeses, and we had 2 from the beginning, the mayor, Grace Gardner, and another councilwoman who's also a civil rights lawyer. Her name is Christy Hosledge. They were always yes, but we always had 3 no votes that we had to turn. So the 27 million involves about 5.9 million of cash, 1 million in economic development, that will go to small business owners to help them shore up their business, provide technical assistance, 10 million in homeowners assistance programs, and 10 million in a land trust to create affordable housing. And this is so historic because this is a city. This is Palm Springs. If you've never been to Palm Springs, California, it is a wealthy, I mean, I'm going to compare it to the Hamptons, in New York, Martha's Vineyard in Massachusetts. This is a resort, wealthy resort town where people go to retire. The average price of homes is over $1 million. There's Ritz-Carlton. There are, major hotel properties, 5-star hotel properties. There are championship golf courses. A hotel stay during peak season could easily be $900 to $1,200 a night. So this is a wealthy enclave. So these people, my clients, this was a David and Goliath kind of fight. These are people of modest income and some, what would be considered of low income, fighting a very wealthy community and winning. So that's what the settlement agreement looks like. It also involves a monument, building a monument to recognize and acknowledge the pioneers, the early pioneers of Section 14, the renaming of a park to recognize and acknowledge them, a day of remembrance, and a commitment from the city to work with the Section 14 survivors to build a racial and cultural healing center. So when this started, this was initially back in the 60s and 70s, always about trying to get recognition. Because if you drive into Palm Springs now, there's a road called Palm Canyon. You can drive down that road, get to your major golf course, your tennis club, your resort property. You won't see any evidence that Black people, brown people were instrumental in the development and building of the city. You'll see some landmarks recognizing the indigenous tribe, the Aco Caliente tribe.
Mhm.
But you will not see anything. So this agreement is going to change that. And in the next year, 2025, the survivors will be working with the city to build out that park and to build out that monument and to create this day of remembrance and to create this cultural healing center that will also serve as a place for artifacts and, the oral stories and the history of these survivors, because it doesn't exist. The Aco Caliente tribe, they have an exhibit at the Smithsonian in DC, and they've built a cultural center. So they tell the story of their, existence in Palm Springs through their eyes, but it has not been told through the eyes. And there's a film project that Pearl and I are working on, again, to tell this story through the eyes of Black and brown people.
So Jam, do we have Pearl? I'm not quite sure if we have her yet.
I'm double checking. The only way that I can do is to invite the person to speak. It's showing two, so I'm just not sure exactly who.
But she's on.
Okay, yes.
Is she on? Because I can text her.
Okay. She is showing that she's on here, but it's showing for two, Pearl Devers. It could just be
Hey,
she
Pearl, are
registered
you
twice.
on this webinar? If so, they would like me to speak. If not, don't worry about it. I was under strict instructions not to bother her because
Okay.
she is literally, I mean, she worked so hard. She has some personal, health things that she needs to deal with. And I don't think people, maybe sometimes we don't appreciate the emotional toll these fights take on you. I mean, there were periods where literally the city was telling us to go pound sand, where months where we just couldn't even talk, where it was such a hostile environment, where people would show up at city council meetings and make disparaging remarks about the settlers. People, the paper would write about the survivors saying this was a money grab, that basically these were people, who no longer lived in Palm Springs, who were coming in trying to bankrupt. That became the favorite word in the press, that we were trying to bankrupt the city. So, I mean, these cases are very draining emotionally. They take an emotional and a physical toll. And then again, remember, the age of I thought the children of my survivors were going to show up. I thought their grandchildren. We had a handful of folks in their 30s and 20s, but for the most part, they didn't. It was the survivors. We lost 34 survivors and descendants from the time, and we targeted from 21 to 24. So
really very similar to Tulsa, and situations all over the country, most of which have not been uncovered. Caskets are still very much buried. And I'm just curious, you spoke a little bit to it, but the long-term impacts of the displacement, the impact on the families over generations. Is there anything more you want to say about that?
yeah, I'll just say this, Nkechi. When I first started going into Palm Springs, it was difficult to even get people to tell their stories because they did what we do to survive. They buried those stories deep in their psyche because it was too painful to think about. And they bought in a lot of people into the narrative that somehow they were the problem, that this land, this community was an eyesore and it needed to be, demolished. So if the erasure was real. So they had to survive in this town. And the way they survived was to just forget about what had happened to them. And so I had to bring in clinical psychologists to talk about racial trauma, to get folks to understand that it was okay to talk about it. It was okay to expect to be compensated, to feel worthy, to feel and to express what had happened to you and to have emotions about it. Because, as Black folks, we have become so accustomed to, just repressing our feelings around these kinds of incidents because it's the way we survive. And so that long-term trauma had resulted, some people, like I said, high level, she's in an Uber trying to join. Yeah, that's what's happening. She's telling me, don't worry, we're good. Enjoy your trip. People, in a lot of ways, had not been given permission to even express how they felt. And some of the sessions we had in the early days, we would just go into a church and have a microphone and let people just walk up to that mic and tell their stories. And that's the trauma, the high level of alcoholism, some drug use, other kinds of, violence, domestic violence. And a lot of it tied to people having never dealt with or processed what they experienced, what they witnessed their parents and their grandparents experience, being torn away from a community that they love. That is that long-term impact. And I had a client who would say on our Zoom calls, she couldn't come into Palm Springs because the streets that she grew up on, the city had literally torn them down. So for her, it was like, you erased our existence, our history is gone. So much of what this agreement will do is give us an opportunity to rebuild that history and to make a mark and to tell this story to future generations. And we were successful in elevating the story outside of the local press. We've had features in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the BBC, the AP, Nightline came in, spent a day, 2 days actually, did a big piece on Nightline, ABC News. So the story did get elevated to a national level, which it deserved to be done. That was important to this community. They wanted people to know about what happened in Palm Springs.
So before we open it up to Q&A, I'm just curious, what advice would you give to other reparations initiatives or groups that would help them towards securing reparations in their own respective communities?
Yeah, the biggest piece of advice is, and Justin Hansen talked about this at the conference. These are multi-level, multi-organization, strategy approaches that you need to, deploy when you are talking about reparative justice. Justin was clear. These cases are not likely in this moment to be won in the courts. Now, we filed a government tort claim, which is what's required in the state of California before you can sue a governmental entity. And of course, there was always the threat of litigation. But in many of these cases, if you're just filing under your traditional federal or state statutes, you're going to run into a problem like the Tulsa, Oklahoma case. You're not going to be successful in court. So the legislative piece, we were working with a local legislator about changing the statute. When you look at Rosewood, Florida, that was a legislative, statute that was introduced, signed by the governor, that paid that 2.1 million out to those survivors of Rosewood. So you've got to be thinking about a legislative strategy. You've got to be thinking about a grassroots organizing strategy. Of course, you need your legal strategy. You need a serious narrative storytelling strategy. We had to personalize. We had to change this narrative that this was just some dilapidated community. We had to tell Pearl's story. We had to tell the story of other survivors of how close-knit this community was, and show the humanity of these people. We needed a strategist involved. So I would tell those folks, think about all the different ways that you can persuade someone, and the professionals who are needed to help you do that. Because coalition building, we had to build power. And I'll say this to you, the Black church, we have a whole nother session on the Black church, because the Black church did not show up, would not show up, and was absent throughout this whole process. Reverend Neighbors, who was very instrumental in the Evanston process, came out. I invited him out to talk to Black ministers in Palm Springs, to do a session for them, to talk to them about the role that they play. Some had some weird notion about this was political and the separation between church and politics. Others were not happy with our alignment with the gay community. Again, some kind of Black conservative approach to Black church and gay people. I don't know. Mm-hmm. It was really, really disappointing. It was shocking. It was a white rabbi. It was 2 white Episcopalian priests, and it was a white female United Methodist Church pastor that opened their doors, who went to City Hall for us, who wrote letters, who advocated on behalf of this group. It was the most disappointing piece of this for me. And I said one time, I am going to call them out, because I think we need to, in this movement. Pastor Neighbors and other Black churches, he says, in Evanston, responded very differently. So we know the Black church can play a role and should play a role in this process. So I encourage folks, to reach out to, Black churches in your community, but find the power base. Palm Springs is a white, wealthy community. 4 members of that city council identify as LGBTQ. Mm-hmm. So how did we think, or who would think, that there could be a strategy that would be successful that did not involve a close alliance with the LGBTQ community? Mm-hmm. I mean, you got to be strategic in thinking about where the power lies in your respective community, because all these communities are so different. And we now are talking about local actions, being that we have this Republican administration, this Republican House, this Republican Senate.
Mm-hmm. So, Jam, I think it's about that time to bring in the wider audience.
Yes, and we have a lot of really good questions, and this next one kind of segues right into what you were just talking about. Is connected in terms of coalition building. A number of people wanted to know how much Indigenous support did Survivor 14 communities receive during this process?
Directly, none. And that was always an issue. And the Friends of Frank Bogart and many in the city that oppose the reparative justice effort would say the city isn't responsible. The tribe is responsible. It was their land. The tribe asked the city to get these people off their land. Our action is displaced. It shouldn't be against the city. It should be against the tribe. And from the beginning, I made the strategic decision that I was not going to pit Black and brown people against Indigenous people, because Indigenous tribe, that Aqua Caliente tribe, in this time period in the 60s was fighting its own battle with the city, with the county, with the state, with the U.S. government over control of its land. We believed always, and to this day believe, that after this matter was resolved, that we would have an opportunity to go to the tribe and to build an alliance and an allegiance with the tribe and to partner with them on things like this Cultural and Racial Justice Center. So a part of our strategy is to go to the tribe now that this matter is resolved. The tribe wouldn't respond to any of our inquiries. The New York Times, the Washington Post, every outlet that reached out to the tribal leaders, they resisted. And we respected their decision to do that. So they were not involved, but we believe that there's opportunity for collaboration now that the matter has been resolved.
Do the survivors, or are the survivors interested in living in the community due to the trauma? This is one of the questions. And will the city create an opportunity for them to return?
Many of the survivors live there. So many survivors and descendants have lived in Palm Springs their entire lives. Now, many have left the city and live some outside the state even, but a huge portion of them live in the city of Palm Springs.
Another question, which park is being renamed in Palm Springs? I know that the North End community there is the James O. Jesse Community Center. Will there be another park that is being renamed?
That is to be determined. The city council, there's a new city council, so there was a transition. Two new members came on to the city council as two were transitioning off. And so the new city council and the Section 14 survivors will collaborate on which park will be named and what the name of that park will be.
Okay. And how was the campaign funded? Did you get any coalition partners to assist? I guess that's in reference to like paying for the billboards, the PR team, and all.
Great question. Great question. This is not an inexpensive venture. And again, I think sometimes we give the impression that these grassroots organizations can do all of this without resources. That's categorically, in my opinion, wrong and a false impression to give people. This was funded because the 501c exists. And one of the first things I did, I have my own separate 501c3 that I've been running for over 15 years. So I am a pretty experienced fundraiser in a nonprofit space. So one of the first things I had to do was to help the Section 14 organization raise some funding. So we went to local foundations in the state of California and got grants. They wrote for grants. We had a funders forum. So in February of 2023, we had a teach-in where we brought in experts to talk about reparative justice. A lot of people had never even heard the word reparations. They didn't know what it meant. They didn't know about the reparative justice movement. They knew nothing about Evanston. They knew nothing about Tulsa. So we had a lot of education to do. So we spent the first 3, 4, 5 months just educating people. And in that weekend, we had a funders meeting where we invited funders from various foundations to come in to learn about Section 14. And that was very, very effective because it was after that the nonprofit entity was able to raise money and to get grants. So from Liberation Ventures, they've gotten grants. From California Wellness, that's a local foundation. From the Weingart Foundation, there's probably 5 to 8 foundations, some national, some local, that they have written grants to and have been successful. That is what funded a lot of these activations. You know, you need sound, you need music, you need, printing. We had professional PR people. All of these things cost money. And so fundraising was a big part of this. So I would advise folks to either have a 501c or be affiliated with one, because that is one way that you can raise funding to support your efforts.
And you just talked about how you spent so much on education, but specific to ally groups, how did your team assist ally groups to educate their constituencies and persuade them to partner in this effort?
Yeah, it was a lot of personal relationship building, and the LGBTQ community in Palm Springs. There are several major groups. One is the Stonewall Democrats, which was the national LGBTQ community political organization. In Palm Springs, the leader, the president, his name is David Weiner, was an immediate ally, and he helped us make introductions to others. There was a group called Brothers of the Desert, which are Black and brown men, gay men in the desert. So using those personal relationships, and we invited them. These were all free, open to the public, educational forums held mostly in church groups where folks were invited. We brought down historians, we brought psychologists, we brought experts, Julianne Malvo, labor economists. We brought them in, and they would teach about, the pertinent subjects. They, would help people understand this movement. That was really, really important. And we would invite our allies and their members to participate.
Thank you. What if your city officials are predominantly white? There is a class action in Canada regarding Africville, where the plaintiffs are being ignored by their lawyers and the city politicians.
Well, everybody on the Palm Springs City Council was white except one woman who's Latina. So that's the reality of a lot of cities, outside of predominantly Black cities. I don't know enough about that case to really give them any concrete input other than to say that oftentimes you are going to be dealing with an all-white council. I'd be more than willing to talk to them offline because I just feel like I don't know. I have not heard of that class action. I have enough information about it.
This was regarding some of the recent reparations bills that were signed by Newsom or not signed by Newsom, vetoed. According to an article by Politico, Governor Newsom cited having no state agency to implement the policy to compensate families who had their land seized through eminent domain as a reason to not give reparations. If it was necessary to have funds sent through an agency, do you suggest creating a new governmental agency?
Well, first thing we have to recognize in California, which again is why the timing of Palm Springs is so critical. There was a complete shift, pendulum swing in terms of the stomach to pass and fund reparations in California. When Dr. Shirley Weber introduced the bill that was signed, that created the reparations committee that went around the state for the 2 years, there was tremendous support again coming out of that George Floyd murder, that racial reckoning, lots of support, which is why we saw in California at Bruce's Beach, that was an eminent domain case where the property was returned to the descendants of Charles and Willard Bruce. Would not have happened in this moment, would not have happened, I believe, but for that moment. Again, that moment where there was momentum and support. I don't know if there needs to be another state agency. I know that if there still was a will to do reparations work in the state of California, there would have been a state agency created. There would have been money given to a nonprofit agency. We have universities. There are ways to get this done. It's not that complicated. I just think we have to accept that the shift occurred. And we now have a budget deficit. We have, and Steve Bradford, who was one of the leaders in reparations in the state of California, started talking a year ago about his Democratic colleagues not having the stomach to do this work in the same way they had a year earlier. We have a governor who's clearly running for president. So all of those things matter. We have a Republican president. So timing on these matters can also be critically important. And I don't know if we had not done Palm Springs under this city council in this moment before the Trump administration is fully cemented, that we would have been successful because those three no's, one of them is becoming the mayor. Mm-hmm. So the mayor on these councils have a lot of power. They can control what gets on the agenda. I mean, we fought over sometimes just not even being put on the agenda. So some ways that the city can ice you out is to say, we're not even going to agendize this. So timing is very important. And we've just seen a shift nationally and definitely at the state level in California around this issue.
Yes, timing is so very important and critical. There's a question about any further reading that you would recommend on this topic, not just books, but any research, theses, or legal filings that are publicly available.
I would advise people to follow Justin Hansen, the work that he's doing out of Howard University. There's another professor named Eric Miller at Loyola Law School here in Los Angeles. Both of them, Linda Mann, I think she may be on sabbatical, but she's at Columbia University. So the three of those professors are doing a lot of work around, and of course there are others, leading the charge on this issue out of their universities, think tanks. I know Justin is starting the Charles
Ogletree Federal, Reparations Association.
Yes, Bar Association, to do just that, to bring together legal minds, to bring together historians and thought leaders. There's just a huge void. I mean, there's just a need for so much more work. The work that you guys do is so critically important, but I'm sure you could easily see having 10 organizations that do what you do and still that not be enough. So, I would suggest follow those three professors at those three universities as a way to just at least get into this conversation.
So both Justin Hansford and Eric Miller have been featured as part of the Reparation Information Thought Series, and all three of them, including Linda Mann, participate at various degrees as part of the Reparation Movement monthly meetup. So we can definitely make sure that people that are part of this network have their contact information, and we're all very much interconnected. Go on, Jam.
I think we have time for one last question before closing out. So how is the city funding the $27 million? Is the money going to be dispersed over a period of time, or will any of it go directly to Section 14 nonprofit for oversight? How will the city be held accountable?
So the $5.91 million will go to the Section 14 nonprofit organization. The rest of the $27 million are programmatic line items that will be funded by the city. The Section 14 nonprofit organization will determine what the distribution of that money looks like in conjunction with their working with. We've brought on administrators who are experts in the administration of large settlements. One of the things that I'm hoping happens is that there is some investments made so that we can really think about how do we make this money make more money and building back generational wealth that was lost. So there are a lot of conversations that are happening now and will continue to happen with the Section 14 survivors organization about how to leverage the direct payments, the cash sum in a way that continues to create more. What we saw happen in Evanston is that once the city process was done, there were philanthropic groups, there were clergy groups, there were other groups that donated. So we see this as the beginning of the cash payments, not the end. And that 501c3 vehicle is a vehicle through which they can continue to fundraise and to grow the pot of money that can be used to, again, address issues like housing, education, mental health, so many other things. We have a commitment from former Senator Barbara Boxer, who's been was very instrumental in this process, to work with the organization to raise $5 million to build that racial and justice center, which again would be a destination for thought leaders, historians, legal minds to come together, resources for this kind of work. So there's a lot that's being discussed and explored about how to leverage this. So this isn't just the end, but this is the beginning of a process. And so that this can be an example and a model for other cities and other groups.
So I think is that it for the questions right now, Jen? Areva, thank you so very much for sharing your expertise with us as part of this Reparation Information Thought Series. We thank the many participants that tuned in, and we really invite you in the coming year to stay tuned to programs and projects that the JAMS organization, the National Black Culture Information Trust, and my organization, the Reparation Education Project, present. So again, thank you so very much.
Thank you guys for having me. Happy holidays to everyone. And I look forward to continuing to collaborate with all of you.
Absolutely. And the
Thank
video
you.
of this will be available. We give our thanks to Pearl Divers also and the many other survivors. And we just say stay tuned for much, much more to come.
All right. Thank you guys. Take care.
Thanks,
Bye.
everyone.